we at Novus have been providing just a full range of services except inpatient, right? We do a lot of outpatient, all outpatient, from outpatient individual therapy to group therapy to couples to what else? Intensives. We do intensive weekends. And we really do a lot now too with partners. The partners of sex addicts have a tremendous struggle in terms of betrayal that they've experienced and really trying to come back from that and to regain a sense of who they are. So anyway, but today what I want to talk about is shame. I want to talk about shame and how it is connected with sex addiction, because it's intricately connected, I really believe. And maybe, I mean, you all are in other addiction settings, addiction treatment settings. I think it probably is present in those too, right? I probably would, I put money on it for sure. So some crises that I think we're struggling with today with our clients in addiction treatment are these here. So the issues that come up before the addiction, I think, too, that were present that I would even say, in my belief, causes the addiction. We can't say that definitively, but they certainly are highly correlated. Child trauma, I think, is rampant in our culture, probably every culture. We're going to talk about the ACEs study in just a minute, so I'll talk about that. Another concept I think we are struggling with in our society is a crisis of worth and value, that we as humans, as adults, don't recognize our value. We don't recognize our own sense of worth. And this is intricately tied to self-esteem, to that, we call it inherent worth. It's really based on the work of Pia Mellody. That was the first time I'd heard of the concept of our worth and value being inherent in us because we're humans, because we're born and alive living on the planet, right? So children are worthy. Children have inherent worth. And we don't, in our culture, in our broader culture, I'm not sure we always acknowledge that enough. I think children are not always treated the way they should be, right? In terms of how they're raised, how they're parented, abuse happens. Also lots of just difficult experiences. So then also I think we have a crisis of shame. We have a lot of people, and maybe some people in this room, I know I've struggled with this, have this belief at times that I'm not enough. That's really what I'm talking about when I talk about shame. Shame being, I'm not good enough, I'm not enough, I'm defective in some way. So have any of you heard of the ACEs study? Some of you have? Okay, ACEs is, I just learned about this 2 or 3 years ago, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. This was conducted in the late 90s, and it was a collaborative effort between the CDC and Kaiser, okay? It was done in California, Northern California, among their health club, not health club, but their HMO members. So they had a large sample size, 17,000 plus. So what they did is they surveyed these folks to look at what they'd experienced in their childhoods in terms of what they thought were traumatic issues, and I'll show you a list of those in a minute. But it was a relatively large sample size, as some of you know. That's a pretty big N, 17,000. The majority of the sample was Caucasian. Because of the large sample size, though, the statistics or the percentages are listed in that chart if you're interested. But other groups there were enough people represented in this large study, though, that they got some good numbers. So, and if you are interested, I know that's a really long link. At the end, I'll give you I can send you this PowerPoint, actually. So you'll be able to get to that link if you want to. But there's a great TED Talk on this, which I recommend. So here's what they asked about. They asked about 3 broad categories: abuse, household challenges, and then neglect, okay? So abuse, emotional, physical, sexual abuse. Had you experienced this in your childhood? And remember, they had all of their health data too. because this is an HMO, so everybody's getting their care under one roof, basically, and one medical record. The household challenges, if you've got domestic violence in the home, if there's substance abuse, mental illness, if there's incarceration, a parent who's incarcerated, or even if somebody in the household is engaged in criminal behavior, that is considered to be an ACE, an adverse childhood experience. Parental separation or divorce, then the category of emotional or physical neglect. So every one of these that somebody endorsed would add 1 to their ACE score, right? So here we have 5, 8, 9, so there's 10 issues in this list. So, and one other thing I want to point out before I move on, I want you to think about what's not on the list, right? We see on this list some pretty common things, and we all have some of these probably. Most people have one or two ACEs, right? Most of us in this room probably do. It's just when we have more, when we have 3, when we have 4, 5, that we are more likely to have some struggles, some issues, and health issues even, or addiction issues, which I'll show you in a minute. They had to, I think, keep this list somewhat manageable for the study. So in this first study, they didn't look at all of the other possible traumas. What about an immigrant coming to America, not speaking the language, a child who can't speak English and is put into our school system, who gets bullied by students, by their peers, right? That's trauma. That's not on the list either. So somebody might not have an addition to their ACE score from these other issues. Think about a child who's gay or lesbian too, and is teased or feels outside of the group, right? Feels different. That's traumatic. Think about racial minorities too, who are raised in a culture of white privilege, who may also feel on the outside. So I would suggest that all of these are additional ACEs that we just don't track, and there are probably others I've missed here. So go ahead, thanks. So here is what we found out, that the more ACEs someone has, there's a dose response increase in these issues. I put in purple the ones I thought were more the ones related to what we might see here in our group. But as you see, there are many health conditions here, but also addictions and mental illnesses, alcoholism, alcohol abuse, drug use, early smoking, suicide attempts, multiple sexual partners, which can be one of the things that might point us toward looking for sex addiction. Okay, risk for intimate partner violence goes way up too, okay? So I think that's about it. So just remember, the more ACEs, the more trauma, the more likely that there will be some ramifications. This is a model shown from the ACE website. I love this because it puts it in a graphic. You'll find, at least with me, we have a few examples of human behavior being placed into a graphic. It makes me very happy when that's possible. So I love this. Okay, so adverse childhood experiences is at the base of our pyramid, right? So things happen to kids, multiple things happen. What that causes, if there are too many, and if parents don't attend to the issues and parent, like they're supposed to do, what happens is some disrupted neurodevelopment, right? So the brain doesn't develop quite in the way it's supposed to. Then what we see as we move up is social, emotional, and cognitive impairment because the brain hasn't quite done what it's supposed to do, hasn't developed the way that it should. Then we see adoption of health risk behaviors as somebody gets into adolescence and adulthood. The more a child becomes more autonomous, this is when we see them start to drink, to use drugs, to have sex, things like that are dangerous to their health, right? Then that continues. Usually, as we see, at least in our clinic, those behaviors have continued into adulthood. So I often will tell my clients, by the way, that these health risk behaviors, when you were in childhood, they may have been somewhat helpful. They were helpful coping skills. So I might fall short of saying they were adaptive, but they helped you get through your family experience. But what happens then, they continue into adulthood. They continue to use what works. Then it's dysfunctional, it's maladaptive, and it's causing more and more problems. And that's when we see people, right? We also, disease, disability, and social problems follow, right? So we can see all sorts of physical illnesses and social issues come from that. And early death. It's true, in the ACEs study they found early death was actually predictable based on higher numbers of ACEs. Okay, so a couple other things there on the left. Take a look at the text in blue. I think that in the past and currently in early intervention, when we first have somebody come in for addiction treatment, we are treating them, I think, at this level, right? We're trying to deal with the disease, the medical issues they're facing, trying to rehabilitate them, trying to address all their psychosocial problems, teaching them to become more self-efficacious. Then we also are at the same time trying to get them sober, get them to stop the behaviors, right? So what I think should happen, and this is where longer-term treatment goes, this is what we try to work on if we can keep people long enough at our center, is to work at the lower levels there where we're looking at social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, trying to really teach them and do the therapy, to do different ways of thinking, different ways of interacting with others. And then what we're starting to learn due to brain plasticity, I think you all had a talk here at Sovereign recently about neurodevelopment and neuroscience, that can actually change. The brain can be changed, and the brain can actually heal and get to where it needs to be. I think that today, the experience of shame limits people from becoming who they're meant to be, right? I have to deal with shame, like as I anticipate getting up here, and when I saw I was going to be standing on this raised box, I got a little more nervous, so I have to keep my shame in check too. That's one of the things I have to attend to. Shame resiliency is what we'll talk about in a minute. Guilt and shame. Some of you have heard of Brené Brown, right? Everybody heard of her? She talks a lot, and she actually piqued my interest in this. She talks a lot about shame and vulnerability. What she does is differentiates between guilt and shame. She says that guilt is about behavior, whereby shame is about existence, about the whole self. So, and actually, she didn't invent that construct. That came out of a psychologist named Helen Lewis in the early 70s. So it's kind of a simpler way to think of shame and guilt, but I think it's helpful in our world and in the fact that we have very many other similar words, right? We have things like humility, for example. Some of us are familiar with John Bradshaw. I'm old enough to remember and have read his books. Pia Melody's work too. They will talk sometimes about healthy shame. And I think that they definitely have some good points. But when I'm working with clients, I find it easier to use different words. I don't happen to use the word healthy shame. I'll use guilt, I'll use humility, I'll use some other word that may indicate healthy shame. So in this talk today, guilt is considered to be about behavior and is, for the most part, appropriate, at least with our clients and with our sex addiction clients. When they start to feel guilt, we think that's probably a good thing. That predicts positive recovery, predicts recovery outcomes to be better. Shame, on the other hand, does the opposite. Shame creates that belief that we cannot change, right? If I'm not enough, if I'm bad, I'm defective, what hope is there for me to get any better, right? There's a hopelessness that's attached to shame. This, based on some of the research I did for my doctorate, I had to do an extensive literature review about this and about shame. and about sex addiction and shame. So when people present for sex addiction treatment, the level of shame that they present with, the level of shame, the amount of shame that they experience has everything to do with how successful their outcome will be, the treatment outcome will be. So the higher the level of shame that they experience, that they have, the more likely it is that they will relapse, okay? So the higher, let me say that again, the higher the level of shame in the person who presents for sex addiction treatment, the more likely they are to relapse, which makes sense, but I had not known that this had been at least indicated through a few different studies. Okay, so, and that's a recent study. Rory Reed is a researcher who does a lot of work with sex addiction and hypersexual behavior, is what he calls it. Research presentations can be really boring, so I'm going to just go through this list very quickly, but on the left are barriers to recovery, right? And this is a list here and includes the studies of what is a barrier to recovery, what makes recovery more difficult. On the right side are predictors of recovery. Okay, so what we have on the left, we have a lack of motivation to change negatively is a barrier. It's a barrier to recovery, right? Think of your stages of change and motivational interviewing. Makes sense. I mean, all of these make sense at many levels, but we know through some studies that there is something to this. Self-hostility, the second one there, also a study by Reed. Self-hostility is highly correlated with shame. It's actually, the definition sounds a lot like shame. If somebody's hostile toward themselves, it's going to be harder for them to get recovery, okay? At least from sex addiction. I would say it's likely true. It's promising that it is in other addictions too. Neuroticism, and I had to, I thought I knew what neurotic meant when I read this, when I was reading the study, and I actually had to look that up. But what it talked about, what neuroticism is, and if you all know this, I'm sorry, but I'm going to go through it. I thought it was like the Woody Allen character, and it is. It's that really anxious person who's self-deprecating and kind of also tends to blames himself, but blames others too, and is just really doesn't take a lot of responsibility for their own lives, their own realities. So some people who meet the criteria for neuroticism are less likely to be successful in recovery. The next one, concern over mistakes. This is called perfectionism in the literature, but they divide perfectionism up. So I want to clarify, because we probably have some perfectionists in here. I know we do, because some of my employees are here. So that's a compliment, everybody. But perfectionism, that concern over mistakes, we call maladaptive perfectionism. That's when we're worried we're not going to do perfectly. And if I don't do perfectly, I must be failing. I must have failed. Okay? That's not helpful toward recovery. So we want to intervene when we see that. And finally, on the barriers list is rumination. Rumination being that anxiety-filled thoughts that we can't get out of our head, right? Really obsessively thinking about something. So when people display these traits in our facilities, in our programs, according to the research, at least if we're talking sex addiction, but I would say it applies to other addictions, we need to do something about it, right? And that's what we do in our therapy. Now, on the right side, we have guilt as a positive predictor of change, right? If I feel badly, in terms of sex addiction, I feel badly about breaking a relationship boundary, about breaking the law, about many possible scenarios. If I feel guilt, I'm less likely to keep doing it. It's not guaranteed, but it's less likely. Self-forgiveness is similar too, is positive. Both self-forgiveness and self-compassion here are linked up with mindfulness too. So if somebody can be aware of the self and compassionate, caring, forgiving, they're more likely to be successful too. Planfulness, that last one, adaptive perfectionism. This is the kind of perfectionism that we tend to want, which is preparing for things. All right, this is another graphic. Remember I said I like to put things in models and in graphics? Because I invented this graphic, so I was really happy with it. But essentially, you've got shame on the left. We see the positive predictors for recovery at the top. The negative ones are the barriers at the bottom, which shows the likelihood of hypersexual behavior. This is a cycle that you probably are familiar with this as an addiction cycle, but this shame-based self-view is something we see in almost all of our clients, not 100%, but most. And even if it's obfuscated by huge narcissism, a huge ego, and it frequently is with sex addiction. So this belief of I'm not enough leads to a desire to distance from painful emotions, right? This is when we see the sexually addictive behavior manifest. So this is the acting out, right? Then the return of shame that's actually triggered at this point because of the inability to stop. So we see the shame come back, and then it moves into the shame of the inability to change. So this shame-based self-view gets reinforced and reinforced, and I think it gets worse and worse until we intervene. So the intervention of recovery can stop this cycle. But also, in order to prevent as many instances of this starting over again, I believe we have to go back to the top and change those shame-based self-views. Okay, this is showing you there's a similar idea, but the synergy of sex addiction and shame. We will see shame as, remember, this global self-conscious affect applied to the entire self. I'm worthless, I'm not enough, I'm defective, results in the belief that I can't change. Therefore, it's hopeless. I'm stuck. Okay, well, one thing I know I can do, I can start to, we call it ritualizing in sex addiction treatment, the ritual leading to the behavior. I can start to watch TV compulsively. I can check out of my life. I can check out of my head. They say something about the inside of our heads, right, is the most dangerous place to be. So that's people really getting out of themselves and anticipating sexual activity. Then we get to the third column, the acting out behavior. It provides temporary relief from the experience of shame when they're in the bubble, okay? By the way, I know these are all men. Because it's sex addiction, we treat a lot more men, but this could easily be women too. It works the same way. And we're seeing an increasing number of women affected by sex addiction lately. And porn. When I say sex addiction, I'm also talking about pornography addiction, by the way. In some of our outreach material, we talk about it differently, but we think of it as very similar. There may be a few differences early on. Okay, so then the last column there is the return of shame, and it just continues the cycle. Existing shame gets reinforced over and over again. Okay? Thanks. So we'll switch gears for a minute because I want to really spend time on I want to spend enough time on teaching you what do we do about shame, but I want to show you a couple of short videos here on how do we see shame and other affect in children. Because I think we're recognizing it. We recognize it in kids. I think most of you who are parents probably recognize it in kids. But in adults and in our clients, in our patients, it may show up differently, right? So that's where we're headed in this next part. So babies give us pure emotion, and which I don't think adults do. I really don't think most of our adult clients come into our office and say, What my problem is I have a crisis of shame. No. The source of my addiction is I feel too much shame. I don't think they do that. So we have to recognize it. We have to learn to recognize it as providers, as clinicians. Okay? So I'm going to show you in just a moment how we do that. Here's the next slide here is going to show you what I think, these are some of what we might see in some of our clients, right? We could see them on the left, we have somebody drinking. Some of these in the middle with their heads down, that could look like shame, right? But we see disconnection on the right. We see some hopelessness. These are the kinds of things that indicate to me that there may be some shame. So this is the compass of shame that I'm showing to you now. This is a construct that helps us to figure out how shame is showing up in our adult clients. What this shows and tells us is that adults respond in 4 ways. Now, not only in one way or only in another way, but a combination. We probably have a primary way we respond to shame, all of us. So we have withdrawal and avoidance and attacking another and attacking self. So let me go in and describe those. If you go to the next slide. This one here is attacking the other. So what we see typically is in our settings, in our treatment milieus too, is attacking the therapist. You're not giving me what I want. You're attacking another member in group verbally, right? Or attacking the program. We see these people their experience of shame is much more palatable if it comes out as anger. Pia Mellody talks about shame as a one-down emotion, so it makes us feel less than others. So anger is a one-up emotion. So this is the person on the right going one-up, acting one-up in a way to the person on the left, right? So anger pulls us out of shame quickly. It's not a great solution, but it works in the short term, okay? So that's attack other. Attack self, that's actually, if you can tell, it's the same guy, same person, attacking himself. So we have the people who are self-deprecating, comedians who use self-deprecating humor. Many of us do that, right? Sarcasm toward ourselves, about ourselves. Believing that we're less than and not enough, okay? These are all sorts of attack self, assuming that we made the mistake. The mistake must have been mine if something didn't go the way it was supposed to go, okay? Attack self. Withdrawal, so we see a boy here on the stairs, kind of hiding his face. I make up a whole story about this. I can relate to this as a kid, getting sent to my room all the time. But really just getting away from the other people, getting away from what's causing us some shame, okay? Hiding. Withdrawal can look a lot like even hiding our eyes, right? That can be a lesser form of withdrawal. Turning away from somebody when we're feeling some shame, not making eye contact. All of these are withdrawal type behaviors, right? So think of the subtle versions of this: hiding, avoidance, avoiding the gaze of another person. Okay? And the next one is avoidance. So I'm a Walking Dead fan, so if anybody likes The Walking Dead, I had to put this in there. But this guy, Rick, and Michonne in the background, these are my favorite characters on the show. They are both huge avoidants. They avoid intimacy, right? And what they're doing is avoiding the possibility they could experience vulnerability or shame. So they don't take a risk by going up to somebody and then backing off through that retreat, that withdrawal like we saw in the last slide. They just don't ever go there to begin with, right? So that's avoidance. Those people who are in our clinic, most of our sexually addicted clients are intimacy avoidant, or Pia Mellody calls it love avoidant. Okay? All right, so here are some ideas I have about what do we do with these types of clients. And please try to apply this to your own treatment settings. But with someone who is a withdrawal type, who feels shame by withdrawing, gently encourage them to join in. If you're a therapist, don't remain silent and wait for them to talk. We've had instances in the past where we've maybe tried to work that way with a client before, and it's like, well, they should speak up. They should, the old way when we used to teach therapists was, well, if they're interested in treatment, they'll bring something to the session. They'll speak up. I don't believe that anymore. I think that it's our job to attend to that shame. And if they're in withdrawal, they're just teetering on the edge of that shame and they don't want to feel it. So we need to make it feel more comfortable for them as their therapist, as their clinician. Attack self. What do you do with these people? Help them understand how their behavior developed and how it actually increases shame. When they attack others, right, it actually makes them feel worse about themselves in the long run, because most people do when they attack somebody else. They'll feel worse later, like, I shouldn't have done that. Like, I wondered last night, if anyone was watching the convention, Sarah Silverman made like a flip statement toward the Bernie Sanders supporters, and I was wondering about this afterwards. I thought, did she, attack self. She attacked other, actually. I kind of mixed this up, but I'm wondering if she came back at the end and attacked herself for doing this. I'm not sure. I wonder, because she kind of angered a lot of people at this talk last night. So she was attacking other, is what I should have said there. Let me jump to that at the bottom, pointing out with attack other. Talk to them about their behavior and how it's not appropriate, how it's a boundary violation. Talk to them how it's damaging to the relationship. Use the therapeutic relationship too, right? To illustrate when it's happening. And be careful, be gentle. When we're confronting this stuff, we can feel like we're on shaky ground. People are highly defended from their shame. Back to attack self too. I think that a lot of deep therapy can come out of this too. When we're helping people look at where this developed. Where did they learn to blame themselves? Probably in childhood. Probably their whole lives they've been doing this. And then avoidance. So really, with these avoidant clients, I can't go in the first or second session to my sex addict client and say, what your problem is you're avoidant of intimacy, right? You're uncomfortable with intimacy, thereby you go out and seek out anonymous sexual encounters. I can't tell them that. They're going to run out of my office and think, they don't want to hear that. We need to wait. We need to spend time. We need to build rapport and slowly and gently bring that out. Okay? But they're shame-filled. I put that at the top, that all of our clients, however they present, all of them have shame. Every client any of you see, have some form of shame, even if it's disguised as that one-up narcissist. Okay. How am I doing? Okay. So I'm going to tell you about this in broad strokes. There's a lot on here. I don't want to read through the slide. But there are three main categories, I think, of how we want to treat shame in our practices and with addicts. Specifically, I'm talking sex addicts, but probably all of our addicted clients. Build shame resiliency. So this is a lot of what Brené Brown talks about in her workshops, building that resiliency. She says we can't eliminate shame. Shame's a part of being human. So let's make people more resilient. Let's help them become more able to handle it. In DBT, they call it distress tolerance, right? So can we teach people to tolerate their distress? And we can, right? We can help them through some of these ways, identifying their shame, identifying the risk factors for shame. That goes back to those early slides when I said, if they're not motivated to change, that's greater risk for shame. Other research shows depressed people have more shame, right? People with high anxiety have more shame. So there's a lot of risk factors for that. We can also decrease barriers to recovery, okay, to successful recovery. So, again, I'm referring to earlier in the presentation, help them to tolerate emotions that have maybe even led them to a neurotic behavior, right? Help them through that neurotic behavior. Help them learn to not be so neurotic, right? With the therapy, help people calm down, feel better about themselves. CBT works well here. You can also, ultimately, a lot of us like to do some family of origin work. That works too. But really, we want them to reduce their self-hostility, reduce their rumination, reduce all those attack thoughts where they're beating up on themselves constantly. And then increasing predictors of successful recovery. Make sure they understand the difference between guilt and shame. People don't know the difference, right? Some of us know. We know we're more fluent in this sort of language, but the general population is not. So again, trying to push them toward the guilt emotion, if possible, decreasing their emotion of shame. What I find is by initially introducing shame, this concept of shame, as this attacking of the self, degrading of the self, and also introducing the concept of inherent worth, that it plants seeds. It really plants seeds in the client. You can talk to them about how their worth, their value is, without question, it's there, right? Even if they feel badly about themselves. But that they have just as much right to be here as somebody else, just as much right to their own happiness, no matter what, then that starts to grow. It's the beginning of a conversation. It's the beginning of some therapy around that issue. But they need to know it. We need to plant the seed. And we don't expect them to get it right away. It really takes a few years, I think. I think that's what it took for me. It was a few years. Because I think, I can remember feeling huge amounts of shame. What I would like you all to do is on a blank piece of paper, you don't have to share this with everyone here, so just turn one of the papers over. What this, and I can email this to you also. I'm sorry that it didn't make it into the handout. This Lifeline of Courage is was developed by Virginia Satir, famous family therapist. What this exercise is meant to do is empower people. It's very strengths focused, okay? So you might think, well, what does courage have to do with shame? Well, we can show people that they act courageously. That can reduce shame. So what this says Lifeline of Courage at the top. On the left, we have past, present, future. You can see that on the left column. And then in the boxes, the top box says, list 3 times in your past you have used courage. And it's similar in the other boxes. List 3 ways you're using courage now under present, and 3 ways you'll use courage in the future. I'd like you to do that right now, okay? Notice how you feel right in this minute, and then write down on your paper there 3 times in the past that you were courageous. Big or small, it doesn't matter. 3 times from the present, and 3 times from the future. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for being vulnerable. I appreciate that. Being brave. Okay. So let me just check my time. I think I'm kind of winding up, so I'll leave room for questions. Our relationship with our own shame impacts our ability to help our clients regulate theirs. Okay? So think about that. We have to address our own shame, or we may not recognize it in our clients, right? We may not recognize what they're experiencing, and that what they're experiencing is shame, and it's a barrier to them being successful. So we've got to know what's going on inside of us. I do want to thank Adrian and all the staff at Sovereign Health. It's an honor to be here talking to you all. Thank you so much. And what great food. This is the best lunch in town, I'll tell you that. That's for sure. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for listening. Appreciate it.